So like we can have the realm for like human reason and knowledge, but you can still hold on to those ideas of faith and stuff.
That's correct. And it's also good to note that maybe intellectual intuition is some kind of a divine capacity. Namely, you think of something and it appears sensibly, because intuition is sensible, human intuition. So for something to exist within space and time, um, it would be something like productive, like you just think of something and it appears in the world. And that would be perhaps how God creates. I mean, if people think about that logically, because God doesn't have to like have to put the clay in. I mean, God is not like a artisan. So intellectual intuition would be, you're right, maybe in the domain of the divine, something, a different kind of, um, I mean, I don't even know whether God has sensibility in the sense that, I mean, according to Kant, that's a, stupid question. So anyway, yes, you're right. I mean, intellectual intuition doesn't exist for human beings, for Kant. So now, with respect to capacity, uh, I think it is perfectly possible for our capacities to decline, and with the passage of time that we have our empirical capacities and the actual exercise of those capacities to change. And this is the response to the S's question with respect to passage of time. Uh, that's a good point, and it is true. Yet for capacity for Kant is really seems to be something that doesn't change. So in the sense that what he is looking at is not good seeing, good hearing, bad touching, etc., things like that. It is, this capacity is only within space and time. And if we are thinking about a radical change in human capacity for receptivity, we need to think of something outside of space and time. So a radical change would be someone hearing, well, I don't know, like hearing outside of time, someone seeing outside of space. That would be a radical change in the capacity, because he really defines capacity in a very narrow way of receiving any type of presentation from the external sense, external world through our five senses. That's it. So you are right to think that that capacity might change, but it's not going to change so radically that my sensibility will be outside of space and time and yours will remain within space and time. So that's the only thing that is relevant for us to understand Kant. I mean, all these questions are great and you should ask them, discuss them, uh, but to understand Kant, you just need to think of capacity as an unchanging power because it's formal. It has nothing to do with the content. Does that make sense? Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So I don't want to dismiss your question. It's just that it will confuse you unnecessarily. Okay. Anybody else wants to add something to space and time, like why it is an infinite magnitude, why it is not a concept? So are we clear about all of these? Have, I mean, as I said, you will be clearer once you start reading further, because once we start with the analytic, not transcendental aesthetic, but transcendental logic, transcendental analytic, Kant goes back and explain certain things like sensation and sensibility. So he repeats himself and clarifies certain concepts. Um, why is time a priori, where it can never be a posteriori? What's the difference between space and time? Uh, why is it good that space and time don't belong to things in themselves? Why don't they of the things as much as our ability. Yes, Esther.
For that question about time and space belonging to things in themselves, time and space are just forms of our human intuition, right? They don't belong to any sort of object. They don't belong to things in themselves. They belong to us because they are the way in which we order the universe, the way we are able to receive sensibility.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. I was
That's
a little confused by that
yeah,
question.
yeah. They should not really confuse you because usually we think if something belongs merely to us, it is subjective and false. This is our way of thinking that Kant is challenging. And if it belongs to the external world, somehow that makes it more stable and more true, more reliable. This is the foundation of our distinction between subjective and objective. We always privilege objective at the expense of ourselves, subjective. And we say objective is good, I'm bad, I make mistakes, etc. So space and time being empirically real but transcendentally ideal makes them universal and necessary. And we do make universal and necessary statements with respect to the nature of space and time. So if it were something that were belonging to things, so if we were to think that space and time belong to things themselves, then if we knew anything about them, we could only know that through experience. In which case, all the qualifications that apply to experience would be valid, namely, they are always contingent, they're always particular. We can never make any kind of general statements about space and time. And that for Kant is a problem. So, and we do, and then to say something like, I cannot experience outside of time is a universal and necessary statement. And it's not even imaginable for human beings. Now, then we say, what about God? It's like, sure. I mean, maybe God perceives or whatever that means outside of space and time. Okay, so that was the reason why that's the case. Now,
Also, Farid, does it have something to do with the fact that like intuitions only work in appearances? At least that was what I thought. Like,
yes, that's question number 6. No, question number 5. So the fact that things in themselves are unknowable, actually, it's great for us because it makes our proposition a priori, namely necessary and universal. Yes. Therefore, they don't apply. I mean, it's not like they don't apply to things. They apply to things to the extent that they are Gegenstand, to the extent that they are objects for us. And unless we recognize our contribution to knowledge, then we are never going to be able to answer the questions of metaphysics according to Kant, because that is the limit. Limit is both something positive and negative. If it is space and time, everything within space and time are universal, therefore it's positive. But if it implies not knowing anything out of space and time, then it's negative. Yeah, Esther.
In a roundabout way, when Kant is explaining his transcendental aesthetic and logic, is he kind of explaining consciousness in a way? Because it's both how we perceive things, and it's an argument for that our mental capabilities, whatever our powers of sensibility, influence the world, create the world, which is a sort of consciousness.
Sure, we can think that. I mean, he's more generally thinking about reason. He doesn't use the term as explicitly as, for example, Bewusstsein that Hegel uses. But consciousness is a particular manifestation of reason in the sense of consciousness of something. So it really makes us aware of something outside. So consciousness might be triggered and start operating with senses because something hits our mind, and then we say, oh, I have a perception. And then I start thinking about that. But it can also be self-consciousness in the sense that I become aware of myself within the activity of knowing. And mostly for human beings, especially through modern philosophy, especially the European philosophy, is that if we contribute something to our knowledge, then it must be wrong, then it must be problematic. And that's a particularly European modern conception of knowledge. Like subjective elements always uh, undermine because we are looking for something stable, unchanging. We are looking for something that doesn't vary from individual to individual. And even today, whenever you say like, oh, that depends on the individual preference, etc., philosophers would get irritated by that because you're always subjectivizing truth. And if human mind contributes to something, it distorts it. So that's a kind of bizarre self-understanding of human beings as whatever we do is wrong, except if we take ourselves out of the equation, then it will be true. Whereas for Kant says certain contributions and structure of our mind not only is necessary for knowledge, but also makes knowledge possible.
If we take ourselves out of the equation, it's just things in themselves, right?
Well, it's simple. I mean, that's the ideal of science. Like no person is doing it. It's done almost automatically because human element is not even in there. Because we always think of human element as something potentially distorting truth. Bias.
But that's the beauty of Kant's critique, right? Is because he's kind of I believe there's like a quote. I'm probably not going to be able to find it. Yeah, I'm not going to try and find it in my notes, but a quote about like never mind. Yeah, I just lost it. It was something about the idea of truth and knowledge. I'm gonna try and find it in the book. Sorry, because it's a really
That's
good
the
one.
beginning
I'm
of
gonna mess it up.
transcendental logic, probably.
Yeah, I think so.
So on page 111, 112.
I think so. Hang on.
So we are trying to search for a universal criterion for truth, but in fact, there is really no such thing because it always relates to its content. So.
Oh yeah, truth concerns the content of cognition, yet truth must be valid for all cognitions. It's sort of the argument that it is the powers of our sensibility and intuition that create this possibility for truth. And in that sense, it becomes universal because it doesn't matter the content of whatever information or truth or whatever that you're trying to describe. What matters is that you're capable of thinking it. You're capable of creating logic or having this logic and thinking about these concepts.
Absolutely, yes. Now we are moving towards the concepts, discursive concepts, rather than non-discursive intuitions. So with transcendental logic, the domain of that separates transcendental logic separates the transcendental analytic and transcendental dialectic. Dialectic is literally what we began the class or our discussion of Kant, like the limits of reason. Dialectic are questions and analysis of the things that go beyond the possible experience. And analytic is within the bounds of possible experience. So we are starting logic. So now we are going to talk about concepts, what concepts are as opposed to intuitions. But for our purposes, it is important to see the difference between sensibility and understanding. You are clear about the distinction for Kant between sensibility and understanding. Okay, anybody else wants to add anything to our discussion from last week? Or should we
Did
move
you
on?
want us to talk about what the difference is, or
Well, if you understood from reading the transcendental logic part, sure. I mean, if you want to share with us, I mean, we are going to discuss it throughout, but I just pose that as a question that should remain at the back of your mind whenever we are discussing transcendental logic. But are you clear initially about the distinction between sensibility and understanding? That is a question.
I guess to some degree, maybe. At least,
Your microphone also is not good,
oh
so
my God, to some degree,
to some degree.
yeah.
did you say sensibility and understanding, or because I had sensibility and sensation as being distinct from one another, but
Okay. Sensibility and sensation are distinct from each other, and then he says that that's more like the content, and the sensibility is the power, the capacity. But understanding and sensibility are different types of powers, different kinds of powers. One gives us sensible intuitions, the other only deals with concepts. So one is discursive, one is not. So space and time are not concepts, they are forms of intuition, but unity, universality, causality, etc. These are all concepts. Yes.
I was confused about his terminology. He says something about the spontaneity of cognition. I don't know what he means by spontaneity in that context. He uses it quite often explaining.
What does he juxtapose spontaneity to, or contrast?
Receptivity, or like
Exactly.
the ability to receive presentations.
So that's sensibility. But what I do discursively, I do it spontaneously. I don't really need always the accompanying receptivity. I form concepts. So I see one blue, other blue, other blue, other blue, and then I say the concept of blue. That's an ability that you can generate spontaneously from yourself once the intuitions are given. Not spontaneous in the sense that you create intuitions, but you create thoughts. So like we talk about things that don't exist. Therefore, they don't have intuitions. Therefore, they don't exist. But we talk about them all the time. Seems to be spontaneous. I say, think of a pink house with a blue strawberry on it. You can, it's just words. You can even like imagine it, maybe you can even maybe paint it, etc. But that's a spontaneous thought. That's a concept.
So, is receptivity the opposite term of spontaneity?
I don't know it's exactly the opposite term, but contrasting term, yes.
Contrasting and
Sensibility is receptive.
okay.
Understanding is spontaneous.
Can I put it in this way that understanding is more like active and sensibility is rather passive?
You could, yes. If it helps you, sure.
Okay.
Fareed, but still in spontaneity, we are like when we're thinking with like understanding, kind of, is it still um like it's still in relation to the givenness of objects?
Well, if it were to lead to cognition, yes. But if it doesn't lead to cognition, like you can, for example, in the third critique, he talks about judgments of beauty. When I say, oh, this flower is beautiful, and you say, no, it's terrible, that is not cognition. That's not knowledge. Like we only agree that there's a flower there, but that judgment that we are talking about is not something that we can agree as that flower is red or blue or green. And of course, in the age of internet, we don't even agree on what color a dress is. I don't know whether you remember this from a couple of years ago. Like, is this dress blue or red or brown? So that kind of judgments that have intuition are more likely to be cognition, and those who don't necessarily have cognition. So we can talk about conceptually about many things without it yielding to knowledge.
So is yielding to knowledge the criteria for something to count as cognition?
Yes, cognition, acuteness, yes. Well, he also talks about practical cognition.
Yeah.
That's a different type of cognition, but theoretical cognition, yes, you need intuitions. Without intuitions, you are beyond the bounds of experience. You are actually learning logic in a very good context rather than in terms of context-free element. So that's good. Okay, so just in terms of planning the second half of the class, did anybody not get up to page 132? Okay, good. So I don't anticipate that you understand everything that was said, but if you read this section up to page 124 in terms of judgments, and if you read what the categories are, we are in pretty good shape to move on to transcendental logic. And we'll discuss a little bit about the distinction between general logic. I don't want to make a big deal out of that, and transcendental logic. And then we'll move on to proper section about the analytic, which is 117, so 119 actually. Okay, so we need to define certain terms, certain concepts for us to understand. Okay, yeah, let's take a break. I'm tired, I don't know, this morning. So let's take a break till 10 and then come back in 10 minutes. Since we are reading just through the analytic, we are not going through the dialectic. He calls this transcendental doctrine of elements. This is part of transcendental aesthetic and logic. So if you look at the general content, then you can somehow situate yourself in terms of one transcendental doctrine of elements is the highest topic, and then there's transcendental aesthetic, transcendental logic, and then transcendental dialectic. So it's actually the table of content is pretty confusing. So for our purposes, we are moving from sensibility to understanding. We are now analyzing what is under the general topic transcendental logic, and that has two parts, transcendental analytic and transcendental dialectic. We are not going to get into transcendental dialectic. We'll just talk about transcendental analytic, and we are not even going to completely read that, just that part where, for our purposes again, that he demonstrates that why pure concepts are necessary for cognition. how, as a result of identifying and explaining and deducing the necessity of pure concepts for cognition, we are going to complete our task as far as our purposes are concerned. So he distinguishes again receptivity from spontaneity, as you were asking, Esther, in terms of one is the domain of the sensibility being affected by the external world through our senses. And then the other is the ability to make concepts. Now, this is within the general idea of logic. Now, logic, well, I'll just go through this, a couple of things, just as a repetition. So on page 106, our intuitions are always sensible. We do not have non-sensible intuition. We don't have intellectual intuition. So, and we need both. Thoughts without content are empty. Intuition without concepts are blind. So we have to make our concepts sensible, and we have to make our intuitions understandable. Actually, they already are, but anyway. So the general logic is, as he distinguishes from transcendental logic, general logic doesn't concern any content. That's our general way of thinking. Things like principle of non-contradiction, principle of excluded middle, the basic rules of elementary and like formal logic. But transcendental logic is the analysis of that capacity, that thinking in relation to objects. So how do we have to think is a separate question than how do we have to think in relation to objects. Now, general logic, how do we have to think, doesn't concern anything particular. So A is either, I mean, something is either A or not A. That A is irrelevant, whatever that is. It could be anything. It could be existing objects, non-existing objects, ideas, whatever. It's a formal, abstracted, empty rule of thought. Yet transcendental logic concerns us how do we have to think with relation to objects. Now, even this question, even the possibility of transcendental logic is really kind of idiosyncratic to Kant. Namely, if objects need to conform our cognitions or our concepts, then there need to be some rules according to which we are going to do this. Because if I say quite generally, without any specification, that objects need to conform my concept, then I'm making them purely subjective. And I'm making that purely arbitrary. I'm making them purely up to my whim to decide. But if there is a logic to it, if there is a logic that everybody needs to think in the same way in relation to objects, that's the domain of transcendental analytics. So if you have a general idea about the distinction between general logic and pure logic and empirical logic, which is psychology, which he doesn't even think that it's anything, and then transcendental logic with respect to objects of cognition, then we are all set. We don't really need to spend too much time on this unless you are planning to be a Kant scholar, in which case you have to deal with it.
Just like those distinctions again. Like I think in the reading guide, it's like questions 2 to 5. Like they're like those 4 questions are all connected, right?
2 sources of our cognition, pure and empirical, yes.
Yeah, question 2. Yeah, okay. Cool. So like the way I like try to I guess so logic, if I'm following correctly, I don't know, logic splits off in, so like there's general logic and special logic for Kant, and then general is like the rules of like without objects, just the rules of how thinking works in general. And then special is the one with objects, but then general also splits again or not.
Okay, so general logic, this is empty logic, is either pure or empirical. Now you might ask, what is empirical logic? It doesn't make any sense. It is, how do we actually think empirically? That is either psychology or anthropology, doesn't affect how do we actually think empirically, doesn't affect the rules of thought, because people constantly have the possibility of thinking wrongly. So pure logic is pure laws of thought, principle of non-contradiction. It's not cultural, it is not empirical, it is not, doesn't change, it's a rule of thinking. That he calls as pure part of general logic. And then empirical part of general logic. So there is the contrast that he makes with general logic and transcendental logic. Transcendental logic with respect to the condition for the possibility of knowledge. How do we need to think in relation to empirical objects? Sensation with respect to sensibility. So, because that doesn't exist, that's almost Kant's invention, to say that there is a logic about how we are supposed to think with respect to external world. Now, why can't there be a logic? Because one would think that our way of thinking about the external world would change according to empirical findings. But that operates under the assumption that our concepts should conform to objects. But transcendental logic presupposes the possibility that objects must conform to our concepts. And how do we need to think in order for objects to conform our cognition? That's the domain of transcendental logic.
So why does he even bother to talk about special logic then?
Where does he do that?
Like, he talks about special logic in, I think it's like page 108. I don't know, I guess maybe that distracted me from but like, I don't like, because then after that, he doesn't really refer to it anymore. But still, like,
I don't do the special logic. I mean, I don't see that. Where is it? Are you mean applied logic or?
Yeah, the logic on page 107, near the end. I guess I called it special logic, maybe. The logic of the understanding special use, which may be called the organon of this or that science, contains the rules for thinking correctly about certain kinds of objects.
Okay.
Yeah, and then he distinguishes that, like in the sentence before, it talks about like understanding without regard to the difference among the objects. So like, but yeah, so it's that entire paragraph, I guess, that's like, do you see what I'm talking about?
Yes, but he doesn't say special, he says special use. And special with respect to one set of objects, the logics of understanding special use, which may be called organon of this or that science. So he like physics may have an organon with respect to how we are supposed to think with respect to physical objects and stuff like that. But that's, he doesn't necessarily call it special logic, he calls it the use of, the special use of logic of understanding. But logic of, yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, so is that, so the way he's using it is more in the sense of sort of like saying, if I was to say like specific logics, that would be okay, cool.
Specific use. So this is the basic distinction that we always have to keep in mind, is the distinction between general logic, rules of thought, rules of thinking, as opposed to transcendental logic, rules of understanding, which is in relation to objects. objects in general, not specific type of objects, but objects of intuition, things that can become knowledge, things that can become cognition. So that's the basic distinction that you need to keep in mind. Now, pure and empirical logic, that distinction, in his mind, he is clarifying things. For those who only know logic, they don't even know transcendental logic at all. So therefore, he is introducing the concepts. So we can deal with how people are supposed to think because these are rules of thought, right? So principle of non-contradiction is a general logic. But then we might think of empirical logic, which he doesn't respect or doesn't think that it is necessary at all. It is psychology saying people, oh, these people are thinking this way. That's completely irrelevant for Kant. And that's a very important thing to observe. Like how we think doesn't necessarily always fit with how the rules of thought. And you experience that, especially in the domain of the politics, a lot. Because people come up with the most outrageous conclusions from certain propositions, and you say, no, that doesn't follow. Such as people say, all those people that I observed so far did this, hence all those people do those things. And you say, no, that's the definition of prejudice. Yes, it is based on experience of your experience or your alleged private experience, but you cannot make a generalization. That's a fallacy. Now, you think that it is important for us to understand how we form prejudices and biases, but that doesn't make that way of thinking correct. It doesn't follow from my experience. And that's really my, actually, in general, the sort of contestation of our general tendency nowadays to base judgments on experience. We somehow privilege experience. We think that subjective private experience has some kind of a validity. Well, sure, for you. You can live your life however you want. No objection. Yet, to make a generalization on the basis of your experience and to legislate policy and tell other people how they should live according to that experience is not only politically problematic, but it's also a logical fallacy. It doesn't follow from your experience that it should be my experience. So that's the kind of ways in which people think and act, etc., that could be empirical logic, which he doesn't really even bring up. Now, there is a sort of pure and transcendental logic, and pure logic is with respect to nothing, just logic, how we think, and transcendental is simply with respect to objects. Now, that objects can be think of two ways, empirical and transcendental. So if we are analyzing our rules of thought with respect to sensibility, and since sensibility has two dimensions, namely the content and the form, this is how we are supposed to think with respect to objects, and this is how we are supposed to think with respect to space and time. And throughout transcendental analytic, you are going to see that pure synthesis, empirical synthesis, pure logic, empirical transcendental logic, like applied transcendental logic. So the way in which we think, we need to think with respect to the content of our intuitions, and we also need to think with respect to the form of our intuition. So transcendental analytic, to the extent that it is transcendental logic, is in relation to sensibility.
Would you please state it again? I mean, transcendental logic and sensibility.
Transcendental logic can be looked at it in two different ways. One in relation to the content of objects, the content of sensibility, and in relation to the form, space and time. So when he demonstrates in deduction how we need to apply concepts, those concepts are going to be applied to time, not the content of our intuitions. So there are two different ways in which we can think of that. But our emphasis is going to be transcendental logic in its general form with respect to time. Now, yeah, this will, I don't know whether it will be clear, as long as it doesn't confuse you, as long as you think of transcendental logic in relation to objects, you should be fine.
Free. I actually had a question concerning Kant said something about cognition that can contradict an object. I was a little confused as to how that could be possible.
Where are we?
Would hang on, let me find it. It was just in my notes.
Are you sure he said cognition?
Sorry, it's probably gonna take. It's when he starts talking about truth, concerning the content of cognition. On page.
Yes. Okay, that might be on page 110, 111, 111.
Sorry, my computer's being really slow. But I thought if cognition is like our understanding of an object, then if it contradicts, like our understanding contradicts the object itself, would an example be like, we know that things are made of molecules, but we can't really experience the molecules themselves, but we know that like a table is made up of a bunch of molecules that are bonded together. Okay, here it is. 112. Okay. On the last paragraph on page 112, if a cognition does not agree with the object to which it is referred, then it is false, even if it contains something that might well hold for other objects. So I was wondering if this is like a specialized cognition, like if it's a cognition that is only for one specific object, like you can determine the nature of a coffee cup versus a table or something like that. But if it contradicts the object, I'm not being very clear. Hang on.
Well, I mean, I would be careful just to formulate your question. So he doesn't necessarily say contradicts, if I see it correctly. If a cognition does not agree with the object to which it is referred, then it is false. So I read that very simply as a kind of empirical mistake. Like you see the cup in front of you, you say this cup is blue while that cup is red. So my cognition is not even a cognition because it's not a true cognition. I don't know what a false cognition would be, but maybe we shouldn't even say that it's a cognition if it is false, but to make a mistake empirically.
I think that
just simply as that. But we are looking for the conditions for the possibility of knowing objects and truth in general is a formal determination. It can never concern the content of the determination. So therefore, if you are searching for a criterion of truth for all content, that's impossible to find. That's why he makes fun of those who, in this pitiful circle of trying, like, what is truth? It's like, that doesn't even make any sense content-wise, because truth is going to depend on the object. And all objects are different and they come from the empirical. So there is no, now, if you say, what is the criterion for truth? Again, you might not be able to, and you will not find an objective criterion because all objects are different, but you might find some universal a priori necessary criteria that are space and time, pure concepts, etc. That's the domain of transcendental logic.
Yeah, I think the place, like, I think Esther's talking about is in 113, where he's like, even if it's on page 113, sort of like middle near the end, like, even if a cognition accorded completely with logical form, even if it, that is, even if it did not contradict itself, it could still contradict its object.
Okay, contradicted object is doesn't agree with the object. So I say it's red and it's like, I mean, contradiction is a little bit too much
Yeah,
to say
like,
for disagreement, but okay, fine. You can say it contradicts the object because I say this glass is pink. And then, is that a contradiction? Well, okay, fine. I mean, it contradicts the fact that it's clear.
Yeah, and I guess, like, for me, like, that part, that sentence, sort of like the thing in logic where it's like an argument can be sound but not valid, was how I sort of read that.
No, it can be valid and not sound.
It can be valid and not sound. Yeah, sorry, that's it. Yeah, that was how I read that. Like, if, like, it formally make it's like correct,
Sure.
but, like, in terms of the thing.
That's
But
a
then
good,
I'd like to ask a question as well. Still, if going down there, like, what does he mean by the negative, and hence the negative condition of all truth? Like, I wasn't too clear on that part.
well, negative condition is like, unless they fit this criterion or criteria, depending on like how you read the, they cannot be true at all. So it is what he calls conditio sine qua non, right? Like, it is not possible without which, sine qua non. So it must be there. It cannot not be without it being there. So our cognitions empirically might not fit with the objects, but transcendentally, they must fit the conditions of formal laws of understanding. That's what he calls. So that is necessary yet not sufficient condition of truth. So a lot of philosophers, not a lot, but like Heidegger after. So this is what is like how Heidegger understands, for example, unconcealment, the revelation. Like, for something to be false, empirically false, it still must conform the formal laws of transcendental logic, so that an experience of it is possible, so that I claim that experience is empirically wrong. For it something to be an empirical contradiction, it must still conform to forms of understanding. So something must be an object for us in the first place for it to be a wrong object.
What do you mean by wrong object?
I mean, like misrecognition, misjudgment, like this. I say this is a pink object. No, it's not. I mean, not wrong object, like, I mean, of course, object is not wrong, but my judgment about it is wrong.
So you mean although you're making a wrong judgment about objects, we somehow still need to conform to the certain rules called transcendental logic?
Yes, that's exactly what Kant is saying. I'm not saying that. I mean, I'm saying that because Kant is saying, but that's exactly what he's saying. So for something to open up, for something to become a possible object for us, so that we can make a false judgment about it. So like, for example, I can say this glass is not pink because I made a mistake. But if I make claims about certain things, they don't even have a truth value according to Kant. For example, uh, all, I mean, I don't know, all pink elephants have um, blue shoes. That, that, yes, you can, it's still kind of an empirical object, uh, imagination. So maybe that's not a good example, but let's just say something that can never become an object of perception. Or something like things outside of time are blue. So this cannot be a true or false statement because you cannot make claims about things outside of time. That's a meaningless statement.
But still conforming to the rules.
No, they don't, because they're
No.
outside of time.
I mean, the statement itself, when we're making it, are we still conforming to transcendental logic?
No, we are not, because
We're not.
there are no things outside of space and time that can be an object of cognition for us.
Okay.
So it's a pure definition. It's like maybe a meaningful statement. So like if somebody says God is pink, it's like, doesn't make any sense. God is not something that can become an object of perception that we can predicate colors. So this is the limit of human knowledge and understanding and reason. These are the questions that we cannot, I mean, we can ask every question technically, but since it is outside of the domain of human understanding, there cannot be a theoretically valid answers to those, even positive or negative. And that's that's why that's the metaphysical speculation for Kant. And we should not be engaged in that. We should only concentrate on things that can become an object of knowledge for us, at least in theoretical philosophy. Yes. So I'm not going to go into the distinction between transcendental logic and general logic too much. You should not use the, okay. So he says on page, just to touch upon that, on page 104 and 114 and 115, if you use general logic as an organon, so just because something is not a contradiction doesn't mean that there is necessarily a possible answer to that. So he separates, like, remember when we said reason can have questions that it cannot answer. So time having a beginning and not time not having a beginning don't necessarily contradict. It's not like A is not A. It's not a principle of contradiction. So we can actually ask this question, and it seems to be logically possible to ask this question and to entertain that there's a beginning of time and there's a no beginning of time. But since from a transcendental logical perspective, that will never be the content of experience, that is dialectic, even though according to general logic, it is a legitimate question. But he says that's dialectic. Both answers are equally valid. So human reason cannot solve this, what he calls antinomy. And some of you in your protocols wrote that, and I said antinomy, namely both of those possibilities are, while they are opposite of each other, they are equally possible according to general logic. Therefore, transcendentally, they belong not to analytic, but to dialectic. hence we don't get into that. That's beyond the bounds of theoretical use of reason.
So dialectic, the way like Kant thinks about it is when we go beyond the bounds of possible experience using the laws of general logic. Okay.
Yes, exactly. Now, does that answer your question about the negative condition of all truth? Like, that's a formal condition. Negative in the sense that without which you cannot even have any form of truth. Now, sometimes we search for empirical truth, but you cannot, that's going to depend on the specific case. So we cannot find a general rule for empirical truth, which is really also related to his general conviction that there can never be anything logical, universal, and necessary from empirical observation. So we are always going to have to discover empirical truth individually, and but it will always be contingent.
So can a can a positive condition for truth exist that doesn't rely on empirical?
Well, empirically it exists when we make empirically correct judgments, but it also transcendentally exists like as long as they conform to rules of human sensibility and understanding.
Isn't that just the negative condition for truth?
That's the negative condition.
Right. So is there a positive condition for truth? Like truth can be such and such?
Not as a
Or is there-
principle if it is empirical truth. It can only, because it is the problem of deduction, it can only be locally true, empirically true. But as a condition for all empirical truth, you cannot find that. I mean, as far, if I am reading this correctly, now it says, they demanded to know instead what is the universal and safe criterion of the truth of any cognition. This is on page 112. To know what question one should reasonably ask is already a great and necessary proof of one's sagacity and insight. For if the question is itself absurd and demands answers that are unnecessary, then it not only embarrasses the person raising it, but sometimes has the further disadvantage of misleading the incautious listener. It may prompt him to give absurd answers and to provide us with the ridiculous spectacle where one person milks the ram while the other holds the sieve underneath. So I don't know how he comes up with this example. It's like I'm trying to get milk out of something that cannot, and I'm holding and waiting for it, etc. So a positive condition for all truth would be a meaningless question because it's going to depend on the specific empirical condition. Yeah, I like that. That's a good point. So that sort of wanting to have truth in all conditions without really bothering to even investigate the specific conditions. That would be an extreme case of dogmatism, I think. I mean, you can be dogmatic with respect to some statements, but to be dogmatic with respect to all statements would be quite an achievement for you. So he explains this on the division of the transcendental logic into transcendental analytic and dialectic. That's simply, again, the beyond the bounds of experience, we cannot really make any statements that can be cognitively, I mean, that would be theoretically valid. So that's on page 116. That part then of transcendental logic, which sets forth the elements of understanding's pure cognition, as well as the principle without which no object can be thought at all, is transcendental analytic. It is at the same time a logic of truth. On the other hand, there is great enticement and temptation to imply these pure cognitions of understanding and these principles by themselves, and to do so even beyond the bounds of experience, even though only experience can provide us with the matter to which those pure concepts of understanding can be applied. As a consequence, the understanding runs the disk by idly engaging in subtle reasoning. It will put the merely formal principles of pure understanding to a material use and will make judgment indiscriminately even about objects that are not given, or indeed about objects that perhaps cannot be given in any way at all. Properly then, transcendental analytics should only be a canon, not an organon, for judging empirical use. Hence, the use of pure understanding would be then dialectic, so it will not be legitimate. Okay, are we clear a little bit? Any questions?
Sorry, I was just trying to find the page for that.
116.
Okay.
Okay, so the question then in front of us is, are there concepts that are pure, because it is not empirical concepts, and that concern the power of understanding, and those concepts can be applied to our experience? So the beginning on page 117 of Transcendental Analytic, he says, transcendental analytic consists in the dissection of our entire a priori cognition into the elements of understanding pure cognition. So later on, he says that this is a dissection of the power of understanding, not the concepts or the, by the analytic of concepts, I do not mean analysis of concepts, the usual procedure in philosophical inquiries, like analyzing this concept or that concept, etc., but dissection of the power of understanding. So what do we do when we use our power of understanding? What is it that understanding does? What kind of power is this? That's what I'm trying to understand. So therefore, he's going to reach these concepts not by taking these concepts for granted, but how do we even form concepts? What is our ability to form concepts? Now, these need to be pure concepts, but that also, in the case of empirical concepts, what do we do? And what he's going to say is judgment. This is the, what understanding does is judgment. Now, by judgment, he doesn't really mean judgment in the way that we understand judgment today as like, oh, I judge you to be good or bad or blah, blah. Judgment is bringing various presentations under one. So whenever I make a judgment, S is P, I am bringing S under P, so I am making categorization. That's really what it is in terms of judgment. I categorize the world. Now, obviously after Kant, people are sort of saying like, oh, human beings always make categorizations. They always separate the world into manageable unities, etc. Sure, but that's how our understanding works. We make concepts because concepts make the world simpler for us, because it unifies. It's sort of like cleaning up, sort of bringing a lot of presentations and putting them into that drawer and saying that this is our concept. So this is what he understands as the power of judgment. That's what understanding does. Understanding is a power of judgment. So these concepts must be, go ahead, Esther.
Is that what Kant means when he says understanding is an absolute unity? Like it's a power that everyone is capable, and all concepts are generated under this power of understanding. On page,
yeah,
the top of 118, I think it's also on 117. Sorry.
oh, 118.
Yeah, 118.
Yeah, that's a little more complicated. That's his understanding of system.
Okay.
So let's just read that section and then try to figure that out. So on page 117, he starts, transcendental analytic consists in the dissection of our entire a priori cognition into elements of understanding's pure cognition. The following points are what matters in this dissection. Concepts must be pure rather than empirical. Pure concepts, right? They must belong not to intuition and sensibility, but to thought and understanding. They must be elementary concepts and must be distinguished carefully from concepts that are either derivative or composed of such elementary concepts. Our table of these concepts must be complete, and the concept must occupy fully the whole realm of pure understanding. Now, this completeness of a science cannot be assumed reliably by gouging an aggregate of concepts that was brought about merely through trials. Like, does this fit? No, it's not fit. Throw it away. Does this fit? No, it doesn't fit. Throw it away. Hence, this completeness is possible only by means of an idea of the whole of understanding a priori cognition, and through the division determined by that idea of the concepts amounting to cognition. And hence, this completeness is possible only through the coherence of these concepts in a system. They are necessary, they must be there, they are complete, they are all describing and explaining the concept of understanding. Now, that's the unity of the system of reason. And, you know, the whole idea in 19th century that our knowledge can only be justified to the extent that it belongs to a system really comes from our cognitive powers, because this is not like a haphazard explaining of how we use understanding. This is a systematic understanding of how we must use our understanding. So,
Just to make sure that I got that right, it's a system of how we use our understanding, and that is the absolute unity.
yes, maybe, I don't know whether it makes a difference, but if you want to explain our concepts that are necessary for us to have any cognition whatsoever, that exposition must be necessary. It cannot be arbitrary. So this is, okay, so I'm gonna go on a tangent, but before, no, I'm not gonna go on a tangent. It might maybe help explain, but yeah. Okay, so one of the things that we say in contemporary theoretical discussions is that we need certain concepts determine our perception. Something like color, something like race, concepts that literally color and shape our understanding. Now, we can empirically find new things that how we judge each other. How do we judge the world? How we judge our empirical experiences, etc. But to say that it is the condition for the possibility is like, you cannot have an experience without this concept. Now, we cannot find these empirically because that make experience possible in the first place. So we need to find them from a systematic analysis of our cognition, of our understanding. How do we make judgments? What kinds of judgments do we make? The form of our judgments is going to lead to the discovery or the articulation of these concepts. So any type of judgment and every type of judgment that we make must be included in our understanding. any and every judgment. How do we make judgments? When we say something is something, how do we make, what is the form of these judgments? Therefore, he is going to analyze first the table of judgments, because he sees the role of understanding is really categorization of the world. How do we categorize the world? By making judgment, by putting different things under different things. That's the categorization of the world. These are all human beings. These are all pictures. These are all colors. These are all leaves. We just categorize the entire world all the time. And that allows us to navigate it. We recognize it easily. We don't constantly encounter new things that like, oh, is this a leaf? Yes, it's a leaf because I already categorized that under a knowable. That does two things. First, unfortunately, puts things that are in common under one category. But what is our problem with categorization? Sometimes we put things that are not the same under the same category, and we make mistakes, but also we erase the differences among those. And this is like the source of all our problems with respect to politics. Like we say, you know, what is racism? It is a, under one definition, it is a like false way of thinking about categorization. Yes.
Yeah, and this, I guess, when I was also really hung up on why, like maybe it's the translation or something, but the stress on an idea of the whole, like why that emphasis in that segment.
Do you mean on page 118?
Yeah, still on 118. Like why that emphasis on, like why saying an idea of the whole as opposed to this completeness is possible only by means of like the entirety of understanding, or like the total of understandings, but why like stressing that idea part?
Just a second. This is the beauty of teaching in Zoom. So this is A65. I want to see what he uses as a term there. So that is elements. Okay. Yeah, idea of the totality. So this is something that reason somehow thinks of itself. Understanding, I mean, reason thinks of understanding. Human reason thinking that it has a systematic unity. Because the problem, of course, is like our knowledge of the world is fragmented, both in terms of various sciences empirically, but also categorically, in the sense that our practical use of reason is different than our theoretical use of reason, which is different than our critique of our judgments of beauty, etc. So Kant says reason has an idea of itself being as a whole, even though Kant contributes to that too, that we are experiencing our reason as fragmented. Certain of my powers can be applied to the empirical world, but I don't think that it is the same power when I think of it in relation to moral judgments, for example, or aesthetic judgments, because I don't feel like it can be the same power because it applies very well here. And then when I apply it here, it just completely doesn't make sense.
That's not a contradiction.
It's not a, well, if I make judgments and truth claims, that it might lead to contradictions, like if I may expect theoretical truth from moral statements. But yeah, I wouldn't make too much out of it, that there's a sort of reason thinks that there is a wholeness, unity of its entire power, but that still needs to be demonstrated in the context of a critique. So that's a question, actually. That's that's a very high level Kant question about the unity of the system.
Yeah, because I was like, so it's the idea that it's coherent that matters. It doesn't necessarily matter if it's really actually coherent.
Yeah, I think so, yes. Esther, go ahead.
And does that coherence include the idea that intuition and concepts are interdependent on each other? Like reason and understanding come from the idea that both our sensibility and our understanding need to relate to each other?
That would be a manageable thing to demonstrate, yes. Because if we have intuition, as long as we are within the domain of sensibility, yes. I mean, we still need deduction. We still need to think that pure concepts of understanding can be applied to objects via sensibility. That he demonstrates, but it only demonstrates one part of the unity of reason. But you're right, it does concern that. Yeah. So pure understanding differentiates itself fully not only from everything empirical, but even from all sensibility. Therefore, it is a unity that is self-subsistent, sufficient to itself, and that cannot be augmented by supplementing it with any extrinsic addition. So this is really a problem for Kant. For Kant, our power of understanding is one and all. It's systematic, it is given, that power doesn't change. There is a universal, atemporal human understanding. Any change for him would be introduced empirically, therefore doesn't substantially at all change the form of our understanding. So, I mean, he's not stupid. He doesn't think that human understanding doesn't improve. Of course it does. But the power itself is always the same. That's a huge problem because that's going to be Kant's formalism. Namely, that knowledge, transcendental knowledge, would be universal and unchanging. If he accomplishes what he accomplishes, that's going to be philosophically a universal, unchanging language. Which, of course, Hegel would have problems with. So the power understanding is one and all. So we are going to, I mean, by insisting that it is systematic, by insisting that it is universal, by insisting that it's complete, that he thinks that there is such a thing as understanding that is unchanging. So what is the guide to do that? And then he always has this like purity dimension, like pure power cannot be contaminated by anything empirical.
Yeah, so the unchanging part of understanding is that always in like form, in terms of form, not content?
Yes, absolutely.
Content, okay.
Always. Therefore, it's always formal. His analysis is always formal. So as formal, it doesn't change. Of course, he acknowledges that content always changes. Precisely because of that, he wants to say form is always the same. So transcendental philosophy, he says, on page 120, has the advantage, but also the obligation of locating its concepts according to a principle, not haphazardly. So for these concepts arise pure and unmixed from the understanding, which is an absolute unity. That's also what you asked, Esther, right? And hence these concepts themselves must cohere with each other according to our concept, one concept or idea. Such coherence, however, provides us with a rule by which we can determine a priori the proper place for each pure concept of understanding and the completeness of all of them taken together, whereas otherwise, all of this would be subject to one's own discretion or to chance. So it must be according to a principle. Now, what is that principle? So
Sorry, Fareed, could we actually backtrack just a little bit?
Sure.
I'm a little hung up on page 119, in the top paragraph. The last sentence says that we shall trace the pure concepts all the way to their first seeds and predispositions in the human understanding, where these concepts lie prepared until finally on the occasion of experience they are developed and are exhibited by that same understanding in their purity, freed from the empirical conditions attaching to them. I was a little confused because I thought the way that intuition and understanding were connected was a bit like the chicken and the egg argument, like you can't have one without the other. But is this one, is that, does that say that our concepts come first? Like it's our ability, it's our power of understanding that once we start experiencing, we can categorize the world into or categorize it in a manageable way.
I think the chicken egg maybe is more with respect to cognition. And you are right that they need to work together for us to have cognition. So he said that concepts without intuitions are blind, so they are empty, sorry. They are empty and they don't have any validity and any kind of possibility of producing cognition. But he is tracing pure concepts to first seed and predisposition in human understanding, where these concepts lie prepared, until finally on the occasion of experience they are developed, but are exhibited by the same in their purity. So these are pure concepts. So yes, he believes that prior, not temporal priority, but in terms of impossibility of adding or subtracting anything from these concepts through experience or sensibility. They are pure concepts. They correctly describe the power of human understanding in its most, what he calls it, first seed, like yes, and therefore you're right. I mean, both of them are right. One is only with respect to cognition, and this is just with respect to analysis. So you need the experience, you use these concepts in relation to experience to have cognition, etc. But this is an analysis, this is an analytic. You are isolating this power. You are describing it in its purity. And for that, you need to go to that way, I mean, that place where it's not affected by empirical at all. So more importantly, our power of understanding doesn't change. Our power of understanding is always the same. Now, of course, you can always ask this question, what is the proper content of transcendental philosophy? Are you describing an unchanging entity? What does transcendental philosophy do with respect to what it describes? So human understanding not changing can only be a formal determination. But in that description of that formality, you still presuppose it doesn't change. So human understanding as a power doesn't even improve in its ability to describe itself. It is once and for all the same. That's Kant's conviction. So far we said this is a non-cognitive power. And this is on page 120. I mean, can I continue a little bit? Any questions? This protocol is going to be interesting for next week. So the understanding was explicated merely as negatively, as a non-sensible cognitive power. And since independently of sensibility, we cannot partake of any intuition, it follows that the understanding is not a power of intuition. Okay, we got that. Apart from intuition, however, there is only one way of cognizing, that is through concepts. Hence, the cognition of any understanding, at least of the human understanding, is a cognition through concepts. It is not intuitive, but it's discursive. All intuitions as sensible rest on being affected. Concepts, on the other hand, rest on function. So here, for the first time, he defines function. So it is not being affected, but function like doing something, function. Right? By function, I mean the unity, and that's going to be really confusing, but hopefully throughout the discussion, it will be clarified. I mean the unity of the act of arranging various presentations under one common presentation. That's really his first definition of function. And how do we perform functions? How does understanding perform functions? What is the act that performs functions? That's the question. How do we realize the functions of understanding?
Is it through, wait, this like through judgments?
Yes, through judgment. Correct. So now the only use that the understanding can make of these concepts is to judge by means of them. So function is unifying. Judgment is that through which we do that unifying, and concepts allow us to do that unifying. So when you have something like a car, so you have a particular, this is an empirical concept, but makes the same point. There's a concept of car, which is empirical. So you see a bunch of objects, but these objects don't confuse you, that they don't cause anxiety for you, they are not unknown, because they are all subsumed under the category. Different, various presentations are subsumed under one presentation concept. So concept is sort of an act of gathering various presentations under one concept. So that's the function which we perform through judgments by using concepts. But these judgments are always, he says, are mostly indirect, because we get these empirical contents from different concepts and then subsume them. So let's just read, because there's going to be a really important claim on page 131. That's where I want to get to. If we can make to 131, it will be good today. So, but in such judging, a concept is never referred directly to an object, because the only kind of presentation that deals with its object is direct intuition. Instead, the concept is referred directly to some other presentation of the object. So for judgments, therefore, is the indirect cognition of the object, the presentation of a presentation of it. Are we clear on this? So I get various intuitions, and I say, this is a car. And then I say, this is a car, and this is a car. And all of these are also under the concept of car. Right? I mean, this is how we form concepts, right? Otherwise, you don't really even have to see all the cars in order to, I mean, after a while, you can say that's a car, even though you have never seen that object.
So, so judgments sort of allow us, judgments are how we, like when we do judgments, we don't we can't cognize the object directly, first off, right?
We
When
can
we do judgments, we can't cognize the objects directly.
indirectly.
Can't, yeah.
Well, okay, so let me read this, and then this will complicate things, but hopefully clarify. So on page 131, he says, the same function, this is on B105. This is very important. The same function, the same act of unity. What is function? Function is the unity of the act of arranging various presentations under one common presentation. The same function that gives unity to the various presentations in a judgment also gives unity to the mere synthesis of various presentations in an intuition. So, let me explain. There are various presentations. I'm only explaining this empirically right now, right? So there are various presentations, a color, a shape, all sorts of other things. I judge that as a car. These all presentations that are given to me in this empirical intuition, I judge as a car, right? Right? Are we okay? So from those, the same judgment, the same function that does that in an intuition and gathers them under a concept of car, but in this particular instance, is the same as judging all different intuitions in different configurations of car and call it an empirical concept of car. So when I look at an object, I see color, shape, etc., and I judge it a car. That's a judgment, right? And I look at another object. There are various presentations, and I judge it, that's a car. This is unifying my intuitions under a presentation, namely car. That is the same act, according to Kant, the same act, the same function that I take all those cars and make a higher concept of carness in general. So you need to see two levels. One takes place at the level of intuitions and judging them as one, this particular car. And the next level of taking all those particular cars that I see and then making a general concept. It's the same function. This is an important thing to realize because that implies that whenever we make conceptual judgments, that is the same function that we make in intuitive judgments, so to speak. Of course, there are never intuitive judgments, but judgments concerning intuition. Because whenever I perceive something, I perceive various presentations, and I put those various presentations under one concept, like this car, this particular unity, this particular object, because every object consists of various presentations that are given to me through intuition. I judge that as one car, a unity. That unity, that those presentations belong together, is not given in experience. It's a judgment that I make. Therefore, I can separate this book from the other book, but the unity of this book and this book are not given to me. I produce that through judgment. I say, this is one object, this is one object. This is not one object, which could have been. But I do not judge this string separately from the book itself. I say they belong to the same object. Why? Why do I make that judgment that these all belong to this, but not to this? That's the judgment. That's the use of our understanding, because I know the concept of a book and I know the concept of a notebook. These are judgments. Our perception already has judgments, and it is the same power that I make all these books and then make a concept of the book, which is above all the particular books. So understanding judgment and understanding judgment with relation to intuitions are the same. Which is an important leap that he still needs to justify to a certain extent, but even my perception of an object, that's subsequently in the history of philosophy builds this idea of seeing something as something. I already see a car. I don't see green metal or brown metal or tires or objects that are separate from each other and somehow I put them together. I do, but that's a judgment. That's the function of a judgment. The object in terms of presentation is not given to me as a unity. That is something that I produce. So there is nothing given in the presentations of this object like color, shape, size, etc., that tells me that they belong together. I make them belong together. And in fact, if you are in the matrix, you can't really even make those kinds of determinations with respect to objects because the boundaries between objects are not as clear as it is for my understanding. I mean, not in the matrix, but in the real manifestation of the matrix.
So is that sort of saying that like even in intuition, that means we're already sort of making judgments.
Yes.
And then, but is the sort of the broader idea there that like the way we think about things always involves like unification?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes. I mean, it's not like our judgment is judgmental and unifying. Our perception is judgmental and unifying. We already see in terms of discrimination. We already see things separate from each other. So it is not with respect to our judgment that we are unifying. We are also already unifying in our perception. So in an interesting way, our perception is already a little bit discursive. You can, and it's a sort of abstract separation. Our perception is already defined by, I mean, it's not discursive, but it's the same function, the same unity. So our perception is already unified.
So how do we get to the purity you keep talking about then, if like it's the case that our intuitions are already sort of sharing things with our understanding and vice versa? Like this whole idea of purity that he sets up, how do we then get to that?
Well, purity only at the level of analysis, separating them from each other. It doesn't happen in actuality. But also here, in order to understand, we haven't started with the notion of synthesis yet, but if we talk about synthesis, the pure synthesis is really the synthesis of time. Since time itself is a pure intuition, the synthesis of time is going to be a pure synthesis. So purity there is simply referred to that which is not given in experience. That's why it's a pure concept. Now, of course, so far I'm giving all these examples as empirical concepts, but once we come to deduction, we are going to very smoothly move from empirical concepts to pure concepts. So, understanding as such can be presented as a power of judgment. This is on page 122. So that's all understanding does. Understanding is a power of judgment. What is a judgment? Unifying various presentations under one presentation. So this is how we operate in the world in terms of understanding. Now, the of course, the implication of this is it gives us an enormous power over things that we perceive, but it also gives us a very deadly prejudice in terms of how we perceive the world. That's why, for example, Kevin Miles believes that we haven't even understand the roots of racism, let alone to eradicate racism from society, because we necessarily make categories. Maybe some categories might be wrong at some point, but we continue to make this categorization in terms of other empirical concepts. Of course, it's a little bit more comfortable to get rid of empirical concepts, but we are never going to get rid of our desire to judge, desire to categorize, desire to make sense of the world and make sense of the world more manageable. So understanding as such can be presented as a power of judgment. For according to what we said above, the understanding is a power of thought, but thought is a cognition through concepts, and concepts as predicates of possible judgments. So, as long as we understand the relationship between judgment, putting all presentations under one, right? Then we need concepts to be able to make judgments. Then on page 124, he is going to analyze all the judgments that understanding makes. And from that, on page 132, he is going to derive all the concepts with which we make judgments. So he doesn't start with the concepts, he starts with the form of judgment. From the form of judgment, he moves to concepts. Therefore, he thinks that he is moving systematically. He is moving from the fundamental functions of human understanding and derives the concepts from these fundamental functions. So he analyzes the power of understanding, the power of judgment, the forms of judgment, gives us the pure concepts that he calls categories.
So concepts are sort of the concepts are the condition for the possibility of judgments. Or
Well, condition for the possibility of making a judgment or judgment?
both.
Well, you need concepts to make judgments, but judgment is a power of understanding. So he's going to analyze what kinds of judgments do we make? What is the form of our judgment? Of course, he cannot analyze the content of our judgments because they are infinite. We make judgments all the time. But what kinds of judgments do we make? And he thinks that if he can enumerate all the forms of judgments that we make, that he can successfully derive all the concepts that we use to make those judgments. Those are going to be pure judgments, yeah. I mean, pure concepts, sorry.
It's a little dizzying just because we're talking about making categories and he's making categories about how we make categories, and it seems like there are just all these layers to the categorization of everything.
Sure, yes. I mean, dizzying, of course, it might be dizzying, but like what kind of categorizations do we make? What is the first category we can think of? Universal. All students are sleeping. Or all Turks are obnoxious. This is a universal judgment, right? Or you be more tempered in your judgment that some of them are. That's another form of judgment. So we always tend to be a little more suspicious about universal judgments. Like if I say all, you'll immediately say not all, right? That's the standard answer in our judgments. Like if you make all blah blah is blah blah, then you say no, not all blah blah, some blah blah. So that's a particular judgment. And then there's a singular judgment. So it's like this particular person. No, it's, you keep saying all Turks are obnoxious. No, you are obnoxious. You are obnoxious. That's one singular judgment. And these are all different forms of judgments about quantity. Universal is all, particular is some, and singular is one. And what else forms of judgments are there? I'll say, okay, let's try to think of a more interesting example. I always think the most boring example. So this poster is orange, or this lamp is orange. Now, that's an affirmative one. Then I can say, this lamp is not orange. That's a negative one, negation. Or I can say, this lamp is non-orange, which means it can be any other color infinitely than orange. It's just non-orange. Red is non-orange, blue is non-orange, black is non-orange. It's infinite judgment. And it can be, in terms of its form, it can be categorical. Namely, this lamp is orange. Or it can be, in its form, hypothetical. Namely, if I paint this orange, it will be orange. Or it's either going to be orange or blue. And that's a disjunctive one. So these are relations, judgments concerning our relations. And modality, as he says, the last category of group of judgments, doesn't really change anything with respect to the formalization of the judgment. It just appears it, is it orange? It is orange. Is it orange? So that's kind of like with what force and modality you make that. Is it problematic, esoteric, or apodeictic? It is definitely orange. And esoteric is, I assert that it is orange. And problematic is like, I'm saying it, but I'm not really convinced about the truth of that statement. But they're all formulated in the same way. It doesn't have any formal distinction. It is just about the modality of the statement. So he says, it's very special. What distinguishes function that it contributes nothing to the judgment content. Rather, modality concerns on the value that the copula means is, in reference to thought as such. Problematic judgments are as though the affirmation or negation is taken merely as possible, esoteric ones that where the affirmation is considered actual, and apodeictic in which it is regarded necessary. So these are all forms of judgments according to which we collect different presentations under one presentation. Okay, maybe we should stop here for a while and then make sure that you're comfortable with moving on. Now, the problem with Kant is the more you read, the more you understand. Namely, like you cannot complete an understanding of one section and move to the next section because you will never complete the understanding of that section until you read the next section. So it's a little tricky. So I say, if you don't understand it, keep it reading. And you say, well, I didn't understand so far. How can I keep reading? Well, if you keep reading, what you didn't understand will become clear. That's the problem of sort of systematic exposition of it. And he is not, I don't know. I mean, he is much more circular than you would want him to be. So he comes back and explains something that is like, why didn't you say that before? That would have saved me a lot of confusion. And given that this is a mess of a book because it's written in 1781, revised in 1787, and they are both put together. So he says like, oh, I should have said that before, and then goes and does that, and then like, you know. Any questions, any confusions, any issues, any problems? How are you feeling? I mean, with respect to the text. So there will be no new reading for Thursday. We are still like go back and read everything after Transcendental Aesthetic again, or up to page 150. Actually, not even 141 would be enough to read it one more time.
Is the plan to finish Kant next week?
Are we in the third week? Yeah, we better, because I mean, this 7 week is like an impossible proposition. I'm like, yeah. He already started to make claims that sort of complicates this issue of the separation between sensibility and understanding. Now, that's his ultimate aim, because he thinks in cognition, sensibility and understanding are going to work together. And therefore, he already makes that crisscross on page 131 when he says the same function that gives unity to the various presentation in a judgment also gives unity to the mere synthesis of various presentation in an intuition. So now, let's just go back to 129 and then see what he says about the notion of synthesis. General logic, as we have said several times already, abstract from all content of cognition. It expects presentation to be given to it from somewhere else, no matter where, in order to then to transform these presentations into concepts in the first place. So that's general logic. This it does analytic. Transcendental logic, on the other hand, has lying before it a manifold of a priori sensibility offered to it by transcendental aesthetic. So now he's posing this question: how do we understand transcendental logic? How do we understand understanding in relation to objects that are given to us through sensibility? Transcendental aesthetic offers it to this manifold in order to provide it with a material for the pure concepts of understanding. So that's the content. Without this material, transcendental logic would have no content. So we are thinking about logic in relation to objects. Therefore, it's a transcendental, and objects are given through sensibility. Hence, it would be completely empty. Now, space-time contains a manifold of pure a priori intuition. This is the time that he uses the term manifold. But they belong nonetheless to the condition of our mind's receptivity, under which alone the mind can receive presentations of objects, and which, by the same token, must always affect the concept of these objects. Yet, spontaneity of our thought requires that this manifold, whatever is given through sensibility, in order to be turned into cognition, must first be gone through, taken up, and combined in a certain manner. This act I call synthesis. So the observation is that we are given a manifold of sensations through space and time. And for that to make sense, we need to unify them and combine them, and that act is a synthesis. The mind synthesizes. The insight here is that the unity of our presentations through sensibility is not given to us in sensibility. it's given to us as a manifold. So what is given to us from the external world through.
Okay.
Are you got all cut off?
Yeah, you froze.
I froze.
Yeah.
Okay, where did I freeze?
A minute ago.
A
Could
minute.
you actually go back to we are given sensations through space and time?
Yes, what was I saying? Sorry. I was talking to myself for a while, so this is really a surreal experience. So how did you all disappear? Like, could you see each other or did you just all disappear?
You left the meeting. You froze and then left the meeting. So
Yeah, we were all fine.
Ben was the host.
Right.
How can a meeting continue when there's no host?
Just change the host.
How did you continue without me?
We didn't.
Oh, you didn't? What is given in sensitivity, sensibility is a manifold. So here is a way of explaining this. Now, our intuitions are given to us in an orderly fashion. And that order is a unification. Because we don't see haphazardly, we are seeing both in terms of the forms of space and time, but also in terms of a unity of objects, that they belong together. We see separate things separately, which has separate unities, etc. So our experience is given to us in a unified way. Now, Kant says, it cannot be given to us in a unified way, because then the form of our experience would not be universal and necessary. It is not given in the manifold. The unity of our experience itself is provided by us. Because if the unity of our experience was provided by the external world, then it would never be a necessary and universal unity. So by saying that it is a manifold, he says it must be gone through and put together, combined. It must be given to us synthetically. But it is not given to us synthetically. We experience it synthetically because we contribute the synthesis to it. What is given to us in terms of content is a manifold, not synthesized mass. We are the one who synthesize them. Now, we need to be careful here because what is given in sensibility is already ordered by space and time. So while we think of these separately, and if we abstract from intuition and simply concentrate on the content of the intuition, that in and of itself has no unity. The unity is provided by space and time. But we never experience it without unity, even though we can analyze it and think of it, because we always experience it in space and time. Therefore, we make the mistake of thinking that this unity comes from experience, the content of experience, but it is not. It is provided by the form of intuition, namely by us.
Wait, I didn't understand that. Like, is it us or is it like space and time or is it like?
Now, space and time are our forms of intuition. Therefore, it is provided by us.
Okay, so it's through space and time that we get it, order.
Yes. But that order is not in the manifold. That order is already our contribution. So the world is never given to us in an orderly fashion, namely unity. And when you look at an object, what is merely given independently of space and time is bunch of neurological impact on our brain, probably, according to how science explains it to us. And it is not unified. It is not necessarily belonging together. We synthesize it and we see a notebook. That notebook, in terms of its form, already contains space and time as a unifying element. So even in our most basic elemental intuitions, there is a unity that is provided by human mind rather than the object. Objects don't give us unity, because unity is not an empirical concept, and it can only be produced a priori. So it is a interesting analysis. He separates different elements of intuition, but he then says they cannot be separated. He asks us to think of them separately, but we really cannot think of one aspect of it, namely the manifold. But he says, don't make the mistake, and that's like his always the kind of caution against empiricism. Do recognize that there is a necessity of the unity in experience, but also recognize that that unity cannot be given in the experience, because experience never gives us anything necessary and universal. So if we are perceiving the world in terms of objects, unities, etc., that must be us, not the world itself, in itself. Yes, Esther.
I'm a little confused as to what manifold means. Could you just give like a definition of that, or is it only contextual, or only used contextually?
Manifold is the content of sensation minus space and time. Then you say, does that occur? No, it doesn't occur. Space and time are universal and necessary conditions for us to have intuition. But if I can abstract from intuition and imagine that I separate from space and time, what remains? Manifold.
But we can't abstract from space and time.
But we can abstract discursively. We cannot abstract imaginatively. No.
But isn't that isn't that what Kant is trying to sort of like restrict, like us making these claims beyond?
Yes, therefore, manifold is not something that I can ever perceive.
Then it doesn't? Okay, wait.
So, but
So it doesn't really make sense.
Look at the chat. In the philosophy of Kant, the manifold is the unorganized flux presented to the senses but not experiences. Experience results from the mind structuring manifold by means of concepts. The nature of unstructured mind is unknowable. So is that a footnote?
No, it's from the Oxford Dictionary of Philosophy. Yeah. So
okay. Yeah, that helps a little. I mean, the structuring the manifold by means of concepts. Yes, I mean, of course, it's not even given as unstructured. It's always given to us structured. But we, in analysis, we say that that structure is provided by us, not by the objects themselves.
So do things in themselves lie under the manifold, or are the content of manifold? Or
Well, manifold would be an abstraction, which would be, I mean, you can't attribute any unity to things in themselves. So when you think of manifolds without the unity, you are treating it as thing in itself. But that unity doesn't come from the manifold. Even the term manifold suggests a unity. It's kind of paradoxical. You can't even say that. It's just like you can't even use a concept because that concept already has a unity. So this is like unorganized flux. So it is an abstraction, it's an analysis. It doesn't occur, but I can think of it discursively, even though I cannot bring it in the front of my mind and imagine it. But our insight here is, Kant's insight here is that the unity of our experience is not given in our experience. The unity of our experience is not given in the content of our experience. Unity is something that relates its form. That sounds actually more simple. So we need to experience it in an organized way. An unorganized experience of the manifold is impossible. I don't even think that it is even imaginable for God. Like, I don't know. I don't even know what that means. Like perhaps something like God experiences infinity in an instance or something like that. So. Okay, I want to stop here. You seem to be sufficiently confused, which is good. That will hopefully compel you to go back and read the section again for search of clarity. And maybe after a couple of days, all these nebulous concepts will be much clearer. So we'll come back to this on Thursday. No new reading. We are still preparing ourselves to go into deduction next week. Okay. I'm not gonna read your protocols that you submitted today. So make sure, even if you don't change anything, please submit them to the final version for Thursday. That's the ones I'm going to grade. Okay, clear? You look a little confused, but okay. All right, well.
I just,
Yes.
sorry, I just wanted to clarify because like the last version has to have like revisions, right?
Well,
Like,
if you
how do we
think
know? I mean, like, we have a thing for how we want to revise them, like, because I thought that you would look at ours on Tuesday and then tell us what was wrong and then we would fix them. But
No.
you want us to do that on our own, or?
Okay. The only reason that you are submitting them on Tuesday is because I know you've done it and I can ask anybody to read it. After we read it, after we discuss the protocols, it is up to you in light of our discussion to revise it and submit it on Thursday. I cannot grade 7 papers on Tuesday, give it back to you and expect you to revise it for Thursday. That's not going to happen. So I just wanted to take the stress out a little bit so that you don't submit your final version on Tuesday morning, because actual protocols would be like that. Like you have to submit it Tuesday morning. But Tuesday morning is for our discussion. So you read your protocol, like Will read his protocol and we discussed it. And if he thinks that he can change certain things and make it more like better, then he can do it. But if he thinks that, oh, this is a perfect protocol as I read it, I don't need to change anything and I don't have time and I don't even want to do it, then go ahead and submit whatever you submitted on Tuesday for Thursday. That's fine. That's what I'm going to look at. Okay, so I'm already going to grade 7 papers every week. I don't want to grade 14 papers every week. So.
I've been trying to like kind of like my protocols, or at least the ones I've done have been like an experiment trying to figure out and learning in the process. I don't know as to what extent do you want them to be like it's not like a sketch, but it's sort of like a process. It's not that clear and perfect in the sense of like um
You mean the
yeah.
first version or the final version?
I'm sorry.
You mean the first version or the final version?
Well, both of them, but mostly like the first one, but also like, yeah, like the second one as well. I don't know if that's okay or,
Well,
yeah.
I mean, the more it, okay, so I'll give you the more it looks like an essay and the less it looks like a record, the better. So try to stay away from Ferit said this, Ferit said that, and blah, blah type of protocol element, but try to write it more like this is my understanding of the material. This is my summary. This is my reading. This is my contribution of the material. That would be better. So it's not, it shouldn't be just, I mean, even protocols should not be just like that. Like, Dan Ferit said this and Dan Ferit said that, etc. But it is more like, this is what it is. This is what I understood. And in fact, on page 135, Kant said this. That also proves this point. So your engagement with the material and your articulation of what you understood rather than just a mere summary, because it is true that you can write a protocol without really understanding what's going on. You can just repeat what is said in class without really testing your understanding of the material. So it's up to you to learn and to push the envelope with these protocols. So like enjoy it, like do something good, like learn and think and object and like be creative. Don't just
Um,
repeat everything I said. Yes,
okay. So I've been thinking of it more of just like answering the questions
sure,
and then
do that too. And if we haven't discussed those, you can say we haven't discussed this in class, but I read this, maybe that's the answer, maybe not, this is the best I can do, that's fine. So like your engagement with you making the material your own, not repeating what I said, but explaining it in your own words. So like as the time goes, like moving from the format of protocol to short paper. And short, I mean, I don't expect 5-6 pages, but if you are go over 2 pages, that's fine. So if I were today, I would just write synthesis and then manifold, and I would write these down and sort of like where in the book, like he says, manifold of pure intuition. What is the manifold of pure intuition as opposed to manifold of intuition? What's that even mean? Blah, blah. So I would just engage with the material that would make my understanding. That's what I'm going to do, actually, improve my understanding of the material. Okay, we went a little bit over today, so that's fine. Yeah, I keep not, like, I don't have my test result yet. So I'm not really sure what we'll do for Thursday yet. So, but it's cold and I'm assuming that you are comfortable in wherever you are, rather than going outside into the class, but we'll see what will happen. I'll let you know. Okay.